All right. I can see myself on the Twitch channel. Hello, everyone. My name is Bert. I hope you all are doing well today. I hope you guys, if you've taken part in the workshop and the convention that Renegade's putting on, that you've been having a good time. I am a Renegade hero. I've been working with Renegades for quite some time now. I've done several cons for them. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about Instagramming and board game photography. So there's going to be, I'm sure, different types of content for different people, depending on who's interested in what. So what we're going to do is, Desiree, if you can move to the first slide, we'll just do the swap.
And that is it.
All right. So again, my name is Bert Hui. I go by Bert. I only introduce myself as Bertrand to my enemies, so that's never happened before in my life. I am a professional photographer. I am primarily portraits and weddings. I've been doing so for about 10 years. And I also have a very strong interest in board gaming, and at some point in time in my life, I translated some of that portrait and wedding work into Instagram and also into board games, because I thought, hey, this is going to be a fun thing. So I wanted to talk to you today about how we can get some great looking photos. Great may be in over exaggeration, but some better looking photos on Instagram, and how you can potentially improve your Instagram photos if that's a thing that you do. Next slide, please.
All right.
Okay, so a little bit of a roadmap, a little bit about me, which I've already talked about. Again, I've done some here and there. I've done some photo work for Renegade on some of their component shots. Again, I've been a portrait and wedding photographer for about 10 years. And so if you have any questions about any of those things, please feel free to ask me throughout my talk. If you look at the very bottom of this slide, I do have a Q&A section, but what I want to emphasize is it's not meant for the very end. So if you have any questions about anything as I'm talking about it, please feel free to ask in chat, and Desiree here will be providing those questions to me all throughout the entire workshop. So a little bit about me, then we'll be talking about the difference between what I call sharing memories and telling stories. And that's a big part of why I got into photography. That's a big part of why I got into board games. We'll be talking about what the differences are between a snapshot versus what I call an impactful photo. We'll go into some really easy to use rules. I put rules in quotes, and there's a good reason for that. But some easy to use rules about board game photography and what to look for as far as what makes a good photo and what is necessary for a photo to be called a photo. And then after we learn those quote rules, we're going to learn how to break them, because I'm a big fan of not only learning rules, but how do you just skirt the line of breaking a rule such that it still ends up being kind of cool, and that how it ends up being looking kind of cool, but also how to still make an impactful photo. Then we'll talk about some tools of the trade that I use, and I can show some of the gear that I've used. I have a wide variety of gear, and I do want to emphasize that it is not necessary to have expensive gear in order to take good board game photography. We'll talk about that a little bit. Then lastly, like I said, I have a Q&A section, but if you pepper questions throughout, I'll answer them. And Desiree, feel free to interrupt me if you see questions as they come up. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so one of the things I want to get out of this particular workshop, I guess, is what is a snapshot versus what is a great shot. Now, that's something I didn't come up with myself. I admit there is a series of books that is really, really great, actually, called Snapshots, the Great Shots. If you ever get a chance to delve into them, they're meant for beginning photographers using, again, a variety of different camera types. I use these particular photos right here in order to illustrate what I feel are kind of great examples of both. So the image on the left is a photo of Dualisor Island. I took both of these photos. They're not pulled off the web, and I use them to illustrate. I use them to illustrate both things, or to illustrate both concepts between a snapshot versus what I call a great shot. So image on the left. And in both cases, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to share a memory. I am trying to illustrate the fact that I played this game. For myself, sometimes I use Instagram in order to remember where I played the game, when I played the game, who I played it with. And that's all that's really necessary for me sometimes. And so if you happen on my Instagram account, you'll see that that's the case sometimes, that I do have moments of time where I do take snapshots. There are also moments in time where I have something a bit more planned out, and that's usually because the game might be a little more, at the time, might be a little more meaningful to me, and so I want to still tell the story that of the board game itself, and I might do so in a more dramatic fashion. So you'll see that on the image on the left, it's board's a little all over the place. There are components all over the place. The lighting is not terribly good. Bottom left-hand corner, there's a bit of glare that's off of the player board, and there's no real focus on that particular shot. But if you look at the shot on the right, this comes from Newton, is a game that I really enjoyed. You'll notice that there are lights and shadows that are being cascaded down. That was intentionally done when I took this photo. This one happened to be from my kitchen as I was playing with my wife, but it's intentional that the shadows are being cast. It's intentional that the pieces are laid out the way they are within the frame. Everything about it is intentional, and that's probably the biggest takeaway that I can provide for a workshop like this with photography, is that when you take a photo, you want to do so with intention, and you want to think about why you're actually doing something and why something's placed, or if it's placed or not. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a great shot, as opposed to a snapshot that's more like, yeah, it's off the cuff. It might still have the effect of allowing you to remember a certain place and time where you played, but at the end of the day, it's hard for, say, someone who's watching that particular, not watching, who's looking at that particular image to know what kind of story you're trying to tell. With the one on the right, I'm trying to tell a story of, I took some interest in the photo. I'm trying to tell a story where it doesn't quite match the theme, but I'm trying to tell the story where there's a mystery about the relationship between the meeples in the background as well as the meeple in front, and so that's ultimately what I'm trying to do with good photography, is trying to tell a story in as impactful a way as possible. Okay.
All right, and so the question from Panda Angel, how do you decrease glare from the components and the board? I know you can shoot from an angle, but what if you wanted a top-down shot?
Okay. So Panda Angel, the glare that I typically would see actually happens. It depends on what their surface you're shooting on is going to be. So in the case on the left-hand side, for example, where I have so in the case on the left-hand side, it's a very small card table, and there was an overhead light that was directly over where the game table was. In this particular case, when I shot at a slight angle, and I actually have glare from that because of the overhead light reflecting off of the slightly shiny cardboard. The way A good way to decrease some of that glare is actually to change out the type of material that you're shooting against. So, for example, and I'll have some examples later on in the slide deck, but if you're shooting against a darker background and a background that's not reflective, that'll usually help quite a bit. You also have to, there are also different ways to light, different angles from which you can light your components, depending on what your focus is going to be. That'll also decrease some of the shininess. I don't know if that necessarily answers your question just yet, but you can always do, you can do a top-down shot and not use a flash. There is a caveat to that, though, that I'll talk about, and I actually have an example of that too a little bit later. Okay, so next slide. So re-emphasizing, same two photos, nothing's changed with them, but re-emphasizing that what I want to do with a great shot is taking photos with intention. Again, my main goal is being able to tell a story with my photos. When I am taking portraits and also in weddings, the thing that I remind myself with, it's almost a mantra almost every single time, no kidding. Right before a big shoot, I only have one time to get photos right for a wedding, right? And so the thing I'm trying to do for the bride and groom's special day is I am trying to tell their story, and I'm trying to tell it in a way that they may not see, that they may miss. Because if you are married, if you're on the verge of planning a wedding, you know that there's all kinds of things that are happening the day of, the week of, the month going up into it. And so my job as a photographer at that point is to tell their story and to capture the small little moments that they may miss because of all the other things that are going on around them. And the same is true with work in photography. I'm trying to tell a story. And the story is going to be different depending on what type of game it is. And we'll also go into that too. I have different case studies that we'll look at. Next slide. Once again, impactful stories. So re-emphasizing yet again that what I'm trying to do is tell an impactful story so that it makes sense, it makes visual sense. I started off by saying that the Duelosaur Island example on the left is just kind of all over the place. I don't know what I'm trying to show other than it seems like the game's chaotic. The story on the right is much cleaner, much simpler, and that'll be another kind of theme throughout. This is, now I do recognize this is my personal bias, but we'll talk about biases as well. My personal bias tends to be simplifying everything that's in an image, and the end result of that is telling a story that is directly at specific components in this case. So on the image on the right of Newton, for example, I'm trying to tell the story about the teacher, which is the main meeple that's being featured there in front. And then what are the students actually talking about, who are the meeples in the back? That's the kind of story that is going on through my head when I take a photo like this. It's kind of coming up with a scenario of what's actually happening or what could be happening. And I'm imagining these things happening. And yes, they're wooden pieces, but it helps me to tell a story, to frame it in a way that that would inform maybe what the game is like, and just kind of give a different feel of what the game is like, at least how it was for me. Next slide. Okay, so I do want to ask the question, what's wrong with snapshots? And my answer is there is absolutely nothing wrong with taking snapshots. Absolutely nothing. And I say that because a lot of people on Instagram, a lot of Instagrammers these days are using Instagram for things like product promotion, for things like I don't know, advertisement, fashion, you name it, and you have it. A lot of it is very uh, retouched looking, I guess you could say. Um, Whereas I think the original intent of Instagram was really to uh, really show what you do on a daily basis. I'll show at the very end too of the slideshow, but I have 3 different Instagram accounts and they're for different purposes. I used to start off with my personal one where I show just all kinds of different things. I mean, my daily life, I'll show pictures of my dog, I'll show pictures of like what I've eaten for lunch, just random things that other Instagrammers I think have done. Different, and then I started a board game account because, not so much because I thought it was going to be a professional Instagram account, but more that I wanted it to be more focused on a certain theme, and I think that more than anything else is an important part about Instagram as far as photography goes, is having themes about what your Instagram account is going to be. So that's a little more focused, which is another kind of theme of this particular workshop is having focus on. Having focus on your photography, having focus on your actual Instagram account, and just having a consistent theme throughout. So again, nothing's wrong with snapshots at all. It's more that if you want to convey some information about a snapshot, that if you want to convey information with a photo and you want it to be as impactful as possible, then snapshots often, I'd say, don't necessarily convey that. How many of you, for example, have gone through? I don't know. You have a close relative, close aunt, uncle, parents who have just come back from a family vacation, or they just came back from a trip. They're really excited about their trip. They can't stop talking about it, and they have a ton of photos. And then you do a family slideshow, and then you're kind of sitting through the slideshow. It's like, okay, this is starting to drone on a little bit. I don't know how many of you have been in that particular situation, but I have been for sure. And I think a good chunk of why I feel that way about it droning on and on is because the photos tell a story in their minds, but it doesn't tell an impactful story, at least not from the standpoint of creating that emotional connection that I think a strong visual photograph can provide. And so this will I'm not going to say that this workshop will uh, is a solution to any of that, but I do want to point out that what I do hope is at the conclusion of this workshop you'll have a better understanding of where I'm coming from. You'll have more intentional photographs, and you'll be able to convey that information in a visual way that's stronger, and that's more impactful. Next slide.
So, question was, what's the difference in product photography versus Instagram shots?
Okay. So I use there's in product versus Instagram shots. So I'm going to say that it's sort of a nuanced answer. So in product photography, a lot of the times, in general, let me start off by saying I'm not generally a product photographer in general. However, meaning that I often am not paid for product photography, is what I mean by that. But the lighting conditions and light is the same, and we'll talk about that momentarily. But between Instagram and product photography, it ultimately depends on where the source of your imagery is coming from. So, for example, a lot of times the more polished looking product photography, the fashion photography on Instagram, is done via SLR camera, or digital SLRs, as is very common these days, and then subsequently loaded up to the cloud, and then they are retouched in Photoshop and Lightroom, and then finally they're put back onto Instagram. And you think, how do people get images like that out of a camera phone? Well, I'm here to tell you, they didn't have a camera phone. That's not to say, let me be clear. That's not to say that camera phones cannot do very sharp, very impactful photos. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I am saying, though, is that some of the more posed photos usually involve a longer, I say, chain of events that is necessary in order to get some of those shots. So in as much as I treat Instagram a little bit differently, because I don't use Instagram necessarily for product photography all the time. I use Instagram largely to share my own images. So I am that proverbial uncle that has gone on vacation and I'm sharing photos. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to take photos in an intentional way so that it's interesting to people, and so that it's so that I can maybe get people interested in a game, but that's not necessarily my intent to sell a game. I think product photography is designed to still make an impactful statement. It's designed to make you want to think, I want that thing, or I want to have this lifestyle, whatever the case may be, or I can't, I can't have this lifestyle unless I have this thing, is usually what product photography is all about. And I don't necessarily treat Instagram the same way. I treat it more like this is my life. This is what I do on a daily basis. I just want to show you what I do and be able to show you in a way that, allows me to express that in a more strong fashion. Any other questions?
We have, I run an Instagram for my gaming group, which I run. So it is a professional page. How can I get epic shots with just a cell phone, not snapshots?
That's a good question. We will get into that momentarily, I promise. Yeah, we'll get into that momentarily. It's a little bit later in the slideshow. And so the slide on screen now, the photo, and I put rules again in quotes, and I'm going to be referring to that quite a bit. The rules in quotes, in air quotes, and there's good reason for that. So when we talk about photography, you have to have light in order to have some type of photography. If you're in a completely black room, for example, and you are taking photos with whatever camera you are going to be using, whether it's a phone camera, SLR, et cetera, you'll get absolutely nothing, right? And that's because there's absolutely no light that is available to you. Understanding light is a good chunk of what makes photography a successful venture. So to that end, what we're going to talk about really quick, I'm not going to dive too much into this. A lot of the following slides are kind of devoted to situations and conventions where, let's say that you are a convention goer, because we're at a convention, even if virtual. You're at a convention, you have an SLR around your camera. You have an SLR around your neck on a camera strap, and you're going around taking photos of board games. And at the end of the day, you want to be able to share your experiences. And so one of the things, so there are three different parameters, or three different things that we are looking for when we're talking about exposure. And I'm also going to talk about how these things sort of translate into iPhones. So I see running comments kind of out of the corner of my eye, Desiree. So I kind of yeah. Yeah. So I'll kind of address those two, and how it kind of translates into iPhones. Again, the answer is kind of nuanced for sure. But so there are three different components to what we're calling exposure. There's aperture, there's shutter speed, and there's ISO. Again, this particular slide and the next several slides are really geared towards folks who might have an SLR, might use their photos out of their SLR and post on Instagram. But I promise there's a dedicated section on iPhone photography as well, or mobile phone photography as well. I don't want to be Apple specific, even though I am an Apple user. Next slide, please. Okay, so the very first thing we're going to talk about is aperture. And what is aperture in this case? So aperture is the size, when you take a photo, there is obviously a hole that lets in light for digital SLRs to the sensor in the back. So aperture refers to how large of the hole is available. So how much light at once can I let in at a time? What does that mean to most photographers without getting into the super nerdy details? It means that you want to use a large aperture when you're in a low light situation. So low light in this case means if you're in a dark and cloudy day, if you're in close to dusk, if you are in a dark room, say you're at a convention and you walk in a room that's not really well lit, or maybe you have ceilings that are really tall and the lights don't really extend down very far, and you have kind of spotlighting. Wherever there are shadows in a room, that's when you want to care about aperture. So again, this is geared towards the more SLR crowd. What I'm trying to do is, for the SLR crowd, a lot of folks, and this is no blame, this is not me casting stones. A lot of folks have their SLRs to leave it on the little green shutter icon, the little green box, pure auto mode, and your camera can do so much more than just pure auto. And I'm trying to get folks off of that little green box, and then maybe change to what's called AV, or aperture priority. That allows you to change the depth of field, which is the kind of next point about aperture. And well, I've got a couple of examples of what we're talking about when we're talking about depth of field, and how to be more intentional with your photographs, how to have things be more in focus with your subjects, et cetera, et cetera. So next slide, please, Desiree. Okay, so this is a product photo that I did way back when for Renegade. I don't know if any of you recognize it, but this is component shots from Castles of Caldale. In this particular case, I call this, this is also a good segue into a previous question about product photography versus Instagram. So in this case, what I'm trying to show here is not necessarily the gameplay of Castles of Caldale, but I'm trying to show the components. And what you'll see on screen is, and what you should notice is that the foreground, or the portions where you can see blurry text in the front, says Castles of Caldale, which you can't make out, and that was intentional. The intention behind that was to add a splash of color, really. And you'll see that there are 4 meeples that are standing on a couple of tiles that are part of Castles of Caldale. You notice that the meeples themselves are let me double check that. Yep, meeples themselves are in focus, and what I was trying to convey in this particular shot was that they're all different. That each particular meeple is of a different shape, different color, and also to show that Castles of Caldale is indeed a tile-laying game by showing a couple of the tiles in the stack. But that wasn't really the focus of this particular shot. The focus on this was on the meeples and the interesting colors that are produced as part of this game, and the fact that there's wild tiles. My intention for showing the wild tile was to generate some questions in people's minds, to kind of ask, I wonder what the wild tile actually does. And maybe it'll encourage people to actually find a rule book online, or maybe it'll encourage people to discover more about the game. That was the reasoning behind why I placed it the way it is. So point being, I guess, the takeaway from this is that everything about this photo is intentional with what I've done. I've thought about what I am trying to achieve with the photo, i.e., I am trying to show that, hey, there's some really cool components here. There's some cool colors. There's other things that I don't know what they do. So if I don't know what they do, I may be curious enough about it to dig into it. And that was the intent behind this one. Now, how it relates to aperture is there's a very, very small aperture. So when we talk about aperture, there's something called an F number. And the F number is very small. And what that translates to is the foreground is very blurry. And then if you look up the frame, as it were, because it's a 2D image, but effectively you're looking back it's interesting because we're effectively translating a 2D image into a 3D one, and that's what aperture allows you to do. Is if you take a shot from down low, like I did in this particular case, there's almost a 3D effect because the front is kind of blurry, then you have a sharp middle section, and then you've got a blurry back section. And again, that's intentional because I don't necessarily want to show what all is in the back because I want the focus to be on the meeples. I want the focus to be on the colorations there. I add the blurry background as a result of aperture in order to remove that to not have that be a distraction, I guess, in the frame. So this is something very similar. It doesn't quite illustrate the same effect that I wanted in the previous frame. In this particular frame, what I wanted to be able to showcase was, again, the meeples, which you'll see are in sharp focus. I want to start staging the fact that there are a bunch that Castles of Caldale is a tile laying game, and so I arranged them in a way that looks like a spiral staircase. I thought it's much more interesting to have layers that I can see rather than just have a static stack of square tiles, right? And that's another way that I use in order to emphasize the fact that there are square tiles, is being able to show the various layers that exist. One thing I think I could have done better with this particular photo actually is use a slightly deeper depth of field. That would have kept the tiles that are in the square in the corners in focus. You'll notice that the actual imagery of those are a little bit blurry, more so than what I probably would have liked actually, and so that implies that I used a very, very shallow depth of field, and I probably could have used a deeper one in order to show, for all the components on this particular frame to be in focus. The other thing that we're going to go back to with this particular image is simplification. I talked about how I want things to be intentional, how I have a personal bias towards simplification. So you'll notice that there are basically 5 different sections or 5 different elements to this particular frame. I have the 4 pieces off in the corners, and then I also have a center stack that contains the meeples, as well as that kind of staircase looking setup that I did with the tiles. And so I like this particular imagery because it is simple. It showcases, I think, the components well enough, with the exception, of course, of the blurry corners. But I like the fact that it's simple. It's easy to look at. There's yet another slide again that we'll go back to, but you'll notice in my original quote snapshot that we took of Dual Swirl Island, the components are all over the place. You don't know what to look at. You don't know what to focus on. There's some focus here, right? Because the meeples are in focus. You can look at each particular square tile in the corners by themselves if you wanted to. There's not much to this particular frame as far as total items goes. Next slide. Okay.
Second. Let me switch the slide real quick. All right. And then they're wondering if you can share your Instagram account. I'm sure we'll probably share at the end, but
Yep.
if you can just mention it, and then we'll
Yeah,
circle around in the end.
sure. So I have several Instagram accounts, some of which are, we'll say, more full than others. So my main board game Instagram account is Bert Does Board Games with underscores in between each of those words. So it's Bert, BERT, underscore does, or underscore does, DOES, underscore board games. And you can see most of my photos are posted there. It's real perfect. Thanks. Thanks, Desiree. If you're interested in seeing any of my personal stuff is Strudel88. That's like noodle, but with STR at the beginning. And then also I'm a big cyclist as well, so I have a couple of that I just started, so I have some cycling photos as well. Was that the only question, Desiree? Okay. So we talked about exposure, and so now we talked about aperture rather. Next thing we're going to talk about is shutter speed. And this one is probably, let me think about that. This is the hardest one to really kind of mimic in iPhone photography. And again, we'll talk about that. I don't have a slide for this particular aspect, but we'll talk about it for sure. So shutter speed, if you're an SLR user, allows you to freeze things in time. You can also create blurry photos. A lot of times what this means is if you're on the auto setting, you might see something that you really like. You'll take a snapshot of it. You're reviewing it in the back of your frame, and you'll start, and then you'll notice when you're reviewing it that, hey, something's blurry, and then you think to yourself, oh crap, that's a blurry photo. It doesn't look very good. Something's happened with it. I don't know I don't know why that's the case. It's shutter speed. And we can go over a couple of examples. I don't have good board game examples of this, but we can go over some of my, I think I have 2 examples to kind of go over those. So go into the next slide, please. I don't know what that question means. Can you clarify? Or can whoever asked clarify? I don't know what that question means.
And then, well, so if someone could clarify what is your shooting ratio, if you're referring to a certain picture. We do have a question before that. So for a complex game like Dino Island, would it be better to focus on a small part like the dice or the dino meeples?
Yeah, so that's actually what I find myself. Typically doing when I am shooting a very complex game like Dinosaur Island, or another game that I really enjoy, Anachrony, or any of the Raider series. Fairly complicated game as far as number of components goes. A lot of times in those situations, I pick and choose the story that I want to tell, meaning that if we're to take Raiders of the North Sea as an example, so in Raiders of the North Sea, the story is that you're playing Viking clans, you are trying to pillage villages in order to earn points, right? If you haven't played Raiders, the board is fairly large, fairly complex. But there are very distinct sections on the board, and so I might choose to pick a certain portion of the board in order to focus on as part of my Instagram. Maybe after I finish playing a game, it's my favorite portion of the board. Maybe I won in a particular way. Maybe it was a neck and neck competition, and then all of a sudden at the very end, I pulled off some maneuver that involves some particular meeple color. There's 3 different meeple colors. That involves some meeple color that was special to me, and then I want to share that particular thing. It may not mean much to say anyone who's not there at the game at the time, but using some combination of words, and also it's not going to be a super uncommon situation, I'm sure, for those who play Raiders on a regular basis, that they'll also experience something similar. Um, a lot of times my intent is to focus on those individuals as well when I take a photo. So it may not make sense for those who don't take, who haven't been in those situations, but for those who have, they'll definitely have that aha moment, or they'll have that moment where they're like, oh yeah, that's right, I've definitely been in that situation, I know exactly what's going on. And so a lot of times that's what I find is useful for to focus on a small section and those small victories.
Awesome. There was a clarification for the shooting ratio. So for every photo you post or share, how many do you actually take?
That's a great question. So it's gone down over time for sure. What I would, I'm going to answer that a couple of different ways. So when you're in a situation where you are, when you're in a situation where you're, when you're, let me think about that. When you're in a situation where you're used to taking snapshots often, and you're not, and again, I'm not. So when you're first starting out and you're doing, and when you're trying to transition from, if you're trying to transition from taking snapshots to taking more intentional photos, what I encourage you to do is take a ton of them. Like, there's no cost to taking a digital photo, right? There's zero cost, other than space. But like, there's so much space on phones these days that's really, it's really no big deal in my opinion. But you take a ton of photos, and eventually you're going to get to a time where you start, and as you start reviewing them, and we can get into that too, I'll get into my workflow. But as you start reviewing your photos and you start thinking to yourself, does this photo capture the intention of what I'm trying to do? Does it tell the story? And if the answer becomes no, then you're going to get to the point where you're going to rearrange your scene, you're going to restage your photo, and then eventually you do that enough, and then you start. It's an interesting mental switch, I guess you could say. You start seeing how you want to position photos. So rather than seeing all the components and then thinking to yourself, how am I going to position my components for an interesting photo? A lot of times these days, what happens to me is I'll play a brand new board game, I'll see the components, I'll read the rule book, and then for me, I see in my head already what the photo is going to be. And then the frustrating part for me is sometimes not being able to mimic what I see in my head. And that comes with, I think, just a bit of experience, and with just taking a lot of photos, because you get to a point where you almost develop muscle memory to not like a certain intention. And so you start to develop a kind of a theme, a kind of a bias for yourself. And which I don't really cover in this workshop, but we can talk about that too, is how to overcome certain biases that you develop over time as you take photos a certain way. And I've noticed it more recently, actually. But if people have questions about that, then more than willing to talk about that, assuming we have time. Yeah. So we're talking about shutter speed. So this is an example. I live about an hour east of Portland, Oregon, and I'm in an area that is very, very popular for. Actually, I was telling Desiree earlier, it's the second most popular place in the world for windsurfing. And I am not often a sports photographer, but as part of a class one time, and this guy was windsurfing in where I live, and using a very fast shutter speed, I can freeze the frame, and you can see that he's in midair. You can see that there are two other windsurfers that are clearly on the water. You can see the fact that there's water spray coming out from behind this guy as he's leaped in the air, frankly. And it was a fairly turbulent day. But being able to freeze a frame is something that again, if you're an SLR photographer, you can utilize that to your advantage. that's just one particular option. If we go to the next slide, please. And this is intentionally taken, actually, for this particular shot, to address the person who was asking how many frames I took. In that particular case, I think, admittedly, I have the equipment to do so, but I probably took about 10 frames and got one good frame out of that one. But that was a rapid burst in order to capture. Now this one's very, very intentional. You'll notice that it is blurry. About 5 years ago, I was visiting China. This is from the Forbidden Palace, or the Grand Palace in Beijing. And you'll notice that there are kind of, for lack of a better term, star trails that pull out from the kind of the center area. I really enjoyed this frame. I saw it in my head that I was trying to duplicate for quite a while, where I could have taken a very static photo of having all these people milling around looking at this particular palace, but I chose to kind of capture it by using a slow shutter speed. So with this particular shot, what I did was I used a lens with a zoom, and the shutter speed controls how long the hole stays open. And the longer it stays open, the more it allows for either movement to be captured, like in this case, or if you don't want it to be captured, then that's what causes your blurry photos. This was intentionally blurry because the thing that I was trying to show in this case was just how much movement, how many people, how much noise, I guess, there was that was going on in this particular photo, and also just how much color was going on. Like, there are people that are dressed in all kinds of colors when I was over there, and this was, like I said, about 5 years ago or so. But that's another intentional use of shutter speed, and a lot of times is to create an intentionally blurry photo. Excuse me. A lot of times, if you're into landscapes, for example, you'll see that kind of flowy waterfall. Looks like mist almost. And that's another way to use shutter speed is to capture things like that. For board game photography, and in particular iPhone, I find it difficult to use a concept of a shutter speed. A lot of times it's outside of your control whether or not you can modify that or not. But it's more likely that you'll be able to modify the concept of an aperture, or to mimic what modifying aperture would be like. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that too. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this one too much, but there is a third part of the exposure triangle called ISO. And you'll notice that I have a note there, bullet point, that says, when all else fails. I try not to modify this too much. Again, this is geared towards SLR photographers. I try not to modify this too much because my personal bias is that I like smooth looking photographs. When you raise your ISO too much, and more expensive cameras deal with this a little better, but when you raise the ISO too much, it's a value that effectively mimics grain on the camera. All that does is, so in traditional film photography, what ISO means is how likely or how sensitive the film you're using is to the amount of light that you're shining onto it. In digital photography, what that translates to is roughly the same, but you start to develop little pixels, little colored pixels that you may or may not want as part of the image. I typically don't like that, and so I call it graininess. What's interesting about ISO is that if you're shooting in black and white, it can add some character to the photos. I typically shoot in color because I think a big draw for me of board game photography is, yes, the textures are interesting for meeples. I typically like the wide array of colors in it, and so that's what I choose to emphasize for myself. And so that's the type of story that I want to tell with my photography. Next slide. Okay, we're going to move on from exposure. We're going to talk about composition now. traditional photography versus the more Instagram-like frame, the square frame format. So traditional photography is 4:3, meaning that it is typically longer or wider than it is. The length is not the same length. The length is not the same range as the width. And we're going to talk about the tic-tac-toe pattern that we'll start drawing in order to talk about the rule of thirds. Next slide. So rule of thirds stuff is definitely something that is applicable to iPhones for sure, because we're talking about composition at this point now. So this is a frame that I took for Renegade for a kind of top-down view of Architects of the West Kingdom, which happens to be one of my favorite games right now. And one of the things I wanted to showcase in this particular frame was that I want to show all the components that were part of this game. I want to show the gorgeous colors that are part of this game. I also want to show an overview of everything, basically everything that that could be happening as part of this game. So this is meant to be a everything that could happen, and tries to mimic a situation where there's a play, there's a game in actual play right now that's in game. You'll notice that that it is a rectangular format, and I would offer that if we were to try to turn this particular scene into a square format, it wouldn't work quite as well. If you imagine, and I wish I had done this, but I didn't. But if you imagine a kind of tic-tac-toe pattern that's overlaid on top of the scene right now, you divvy it up into effectively 9 different squares, right? And so you have the way that I envision this right here is right after where the player boards on the left-hand side are. So the right-hand side of the player boards, there's a line that's drawn there, vertical line that's drawn there. There's also a vertical line that's drawn on the left-hand side of the right player boards. So the corners of those, there's a vertical line that's drawn there. And then there's 2 lines that are drawn horizontally across the black areas in the middle. I divvied it up into 9 different squares effectively whenever I shoot with a format that is a rectangle. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to place the important points within the intersections of those rectangles, and that's a general quote rule that people follow with respect to the rectangular frame. The idea behind that is that those are points in the frame where you have the most impactful let me back up. It's points in the frame where your eye is drawn to the most, and it's been shown over time, I guess, is best to say, and so if that's the case, then that's where you also want to put your most either the most colorful thing, or you want to have something that draws the attention to that draws the eye the viewer's attention to those locations. And so you'll notice that I put the player boards off in the corners, and then the places where I would have the intersections, for the most part. Is that true in this case? No, that's not true. I could have done a little better job placing the board, the actual game board, in the center, because my intention would have been to actually place the corners of the game board at those intersecting points of the frame. So this is slightly offset from how I think I would have preferred to do it, but I think it illustrates a good chunk of what I want to accomplish with this, which is just showing the colorful components here and showing the general gameplay of this particular setup. Are there any questions about any of the? Again, keep the questions flowing if there's any questions here.
We did have one question come in. So from Goldfinch Gamers, how do you get the best overhead shots possible?
That's a fantastic question. So I happen to have I have a tripod set up, and I typically have a table that's fairly low to the ground. And so I keep in this. The way that I've framed this particular, my typical board game setup when I'm doing, say, product shots, I have a lowish table, like one that you might sit around, like a coffee table. I drape, that's black felt that is in the background, and I have a tripod that has an extension arm that gets directly overhead. This isn't exactly overhead. This particular shot was actually handheld. But if on this particular day, I didn't have the setup that I have now, actually. And so what I did in this particular case was I used the black felt or the black backdrop is still black felt. But in this particular case, I had set up on my dining room table, draped it with black felt, set up the game, and I stood up and over on a chair, on a stepping stool, in fact. Typically, what I'll do is, now that I have this lower to the ground table, it's easier to set up a tripod. I have an extension arm that holds my camera in place, and I can direct my camera straight down, or as straight down as possible. And then I use the back of I use the camera in order to, if I'm positioning an iPhone, then what I do is I'd have to constantly look to see how it is and adjust. I don't have a good answer for that for an iPhone. This particular shot was done with an SLR, so I admitted that. Does that answer the question about overhead shot?
I think so. I mean, I'm sure you'll probably have some more tips along the way, but we do have the question about how can we reduce overhead glare. You had talked about it a little bit in the beginning, but for someone who might have joined in a little late.
Sure. So I was talking about overhead glare. There's a question earlier about overhead glare, and about, I think the question before was, how do you eliminate overhead glare from if you're trying to shoot directly overhead? I typically don't get glare from that because the lighting that I use the lighting source that I use doesn't come from an overhead light sometimes. I sometimes would, the lighting in this particular scene, for example, comes from side lighting there are lights that are positioned around the outside edges of the board. I think in this case I had 2 different light sources. Makes it hard to shoot if you obviously have no light, but I do have 2 fairly large and closely positioned lights that are positioned. Let's see. In this case, it was frame upper left, and I think it was frame upper left and frame lower right is how I positioned the lights. So outside of the frame is where I had the light shining. And it's hard to see from this particular frame, but you'll see the shadows, I think, on both sides of where those lights are being targeted, I guess you could say, focused. And so if you happen to have an overhead light that is your primary light source, one of the things you can do, it's a little bit harder, admittedly, but one of the things you can do, we'll talk about that in the lighting portion of this slideshow, but if you spread the light out a bit, that's ultimately what would cause the glare to happen. And we'll talk about that momentarily when I get to the lighting portion. I don't have any slides for that, unfortunately, but we'll talk about it for sure. Yeah, we'll talk about it. Next slide, please. So there are some unique challenges, I think, with challenges is probably, I'll call the term challenges because relative to traditional 4:3 ratio photography, the square frame is a bit interesting. And I don't want to read everything that's necessarily on screen because, PowerPoints are not meant for that. But You can take a look at the points for why I think square framing is a bit of a challenge. A lot of the times, because of the square nature of the frame, the rule of thirds rule that we talked about, where you're drawing a tic-tac-toe pattern, not quite as impactful, meaning that your most important subjects don't have to be at those intersecting points. You want to have your subject matter somewhat in the center of the frame, and much to and it's kind of aligned with my bias to simplify the materials or the subjects that are in a frame. So you want to have as few subjects as possible inside an Instagram frame, which kind of goes back to the earlier question about hey, if you have a game like Dinosaur Island that's got a ton of different components, how do you isolate and how do you do that? So I think having your subjects isolated and somewhat in the subjective frame, filling the frame, is a good way in order to help tell a story, and makes the Instagram photo much more powerful and tells a better, makes the photo more impactful. Repeating geometric patterns is another thing that really, really helps with square photography. I've got a couple of examples of that as well. Next slide. Okay, I didn't have any slides to talk about this, but so if anyone has any questions about this, leave them in the comments, and I'm sure Desiree will get to them. This is probably the what's interesting about lighting is that this is the easiest way to improve your product photography, not just product photography, but to create a more impactful photo, but also the hardest to understand. I know it was the case for me. And when I say the easiest to do, I mean that you can take any household items, which is sort of the intent also behind this workshop, is how do you take regular household things like lights, lamps, et cetera, and what can you do in order to improve that? Well, lighting is definitely one of the things that you can modify really easily with just any common household good. I will demonstrate in real time. Actually, not in real time, but I'll show you what I mean though. For example, most powerful, not kidding, the most powerful piece of modifier, light modifier that you can have is this. This is a blank sheet of paper. No kidding. White sheet of paper is probably the most powerful modifier for board game photography that you can utilize. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. Okay, so we'll talk about some of the qualities of light that you're looking for, and this is probably the most pertinent to for mobile phone photographers as well as SLR photographers. So if you get as far as composition goes, this is probably the piece that will probably have the most effect and most bang for the buck, as it were. So the color and temperature of light is always really interesting, because if you notice when you first wake up in the morning, and let's say I'm kind of a late riser, and so my typical wake up time is about 9 o'clock if I'm lucky. And so at that point in the day, if I have a sunny day, the sun's already on the sky, and like assuming you have a clear day, the sky is already blue. And the light that you have at that point has a certain color temperature with it. And by temperature, I mean it's the quality of how yellow or how white the light is going to be. It's usually measured in photography terms as kelvins, and so that's just a fancy term for how white versus how yellow the light becomes. You'll see it recognized for SLR photographers as a term called white balance, and that affects the imagery and the story that you're trying to convey. For example, if you're looking at an old photograph let's say from the early 20th century, you'll notice that an aged-looking photograph tends to be more yellow, and it's that yellowness, that warmth, that gives that some character, right? That gives it that kind of feel that you are looking at an aged photograph. It's what gives us the ability to take modern techniques like Photoshop to digitally age a photo, and it's a really important quality to be able to change the impact that you're trying to convey. Next thing that is really important about light, it's the direction of light, right? So a lot of times my pure lighting source is I have a fairly large window in my studio area, and I'll typically attempt to take photos during the daytime when I can take advantage of that light coming through the window. And again, it depends on the feel that I want to try to convey with the game that I'm playing, or with the game I'm trying to feature. A lot of times I use window light or directioned window light in order to showcase games that I feel are more playful, that have playful kind of characteristics. I don't have a good example at the moment, but if I were to say take a Renegade example, so the one I can think of is I'll use window light, for example, to capture photographs of say Charterstone, which have really kind of playful, really light scenes, and I'll use more studio lighting for things like Clank, which for me, I love Clank, but it's a somewhat more like in story. I'm not saying the actual gameplay itself, but in story, it's somewhat more of a darker theme, because you're delving into a dungeon, you're thieves, you're trying to steal dragon eggs, and the theme, I think, and the story that you're trying to convey is a lot darker. And so I typically try to match the light source with respect to what type of game I'm playing, in order to kind of re-emphasize, both for myself as I'm shooting, but also re-emphasize the type of game that this might be. And that's one of those biases that I recognize about myself. Like, I could very well put Clank using window light, and then I could treat it as a different type of game. But it's not something that I do on a regular basis. Conversely, I could treat Charterstone as a super cutthroat game about civilization building, right? And then start using studio lighting. But again, that's one of my biases that I sometimes try to overcome. And as I try to expand my own set of internal rules, I guess you could say. One of the things about the size, so the last kind of characteristic about light, it's probably not all of them, but these are the main ones that that is really easy to control, is the size of the light. You'll notice that I put size of the light in quotes. And makes sense. I'll try to use some analogies in the real world that may or may not make sense. If you have questions about that, leave them in the comments, and I'll try to address them. So the size of the light does not necessarily mean that you have to have a very, very, very large light source. It's all relative to what you're trying to photograph. So for example, I'll actually demonstrate. 1 second here. Pull it out. So this is my primary light source. This is for my SLR gear, I'm a Canon shooter, and so this is just what they call flashlight, speed light. And it's just Canon's term for flash photography. That's typically my light source whenever I do shots, or if I want to emphasize a portion of the light. Sorry, a portion of the scene. And it by itself, there is this little square thing here, like this section right here is just a rectangle. It probably measures, I don't know, about 1.5 inches by about 3 inches or so. And whenever I use a light source like that, and I try to photograph something, relative to the size of the thing that I am photographing, it's not very large. In fact, it's almost like the distinction between looking at the sun, which we know in real life the sun is massive, right? But relative to how far the sun is from anything that provides light to us as Earthlings, it's a pinpoint. Um, Whenever you have a pinpoint source of light that you're trying to show on something, you're going to get very, very, very harsh lighting. And by harsh lighting, I mean that you're going to have very strong contrast in images. So you're going to have a very bright portion of the image, and then you're also going to have a very dark portion of the image, and there's no real in between there. One of my personal biases, and that might be cool in some images. My personal bias is I try to even out the light across the spectrum, and the way that you do that is we go back to our main lighting source, our shiny piece of paper, or our regular standard 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And what I typically do is I'll take my lighting source, which is again my speed light, and I'll bounce it against a sheet of paper, and I'll try to reflect that light against whatever I'm trying to photograph. So in this way, what you're trying to do is you expand the amount of space that is relative to my subject, and then you basically make the light softer. And so rather than feeling like you're being attacked by light, it's almost like you're being caressed by a warm blanket of light when you use and bounces light off the sheet of paper. And so it's like I don't know how to describe it. I guess it's like a blanket as opposed to a laser beam of light. The same amount. It's just spread out more evenly, so that it's more even across your entire frame. And point of that is that when you have a more evenly distributed light source, oops, I almost knocked over my coffee. When you have a more evenly distributed light source, you just get more even light. And unless you want to showcase something specifically, I'd say that that's a really good way to start improving your photography, in that you're able to you're able to show the shadows a bit more subtly. You're able to show the pieces if you're trying to focus on a meeple. You're able to show some of the cracks and crevices are in the wooden bits a bit more carefully. So that's a good way to do some light things. It's not the I wish I had some examples in the slideshows to be able to show like the kind of qualities of light. But if there's any questions about that, just shoot them into the chat, and I'd be more than happy to answer them.
We do have a question about if you mentioned or recommended a book to learn basic photography. Just a reminder what the name of it was.
Yeah. So there's a series of I can't remember if they are camera manufacturer specific or not. I don't think they are. At least I hope they're not. But there's a series of books published by Peach Pit Press called Snapshots to Great Shots. And there's usually like a subheading to it, meaning that it might say Snapshots to Great Shots, food photography, Snapshots to Great Shots, landscape. I can't remember. I might be making that part up, but it's definitely called Snapshots to Great Shots. It's what I would recommend. Really easy reading. Takes into account the fact that you're a beginning photographer, teaches you some concepts. A lot of what I'm covering in here actually is probably covered in a bit more detail as part of those books. And there's fantastic imagery to boot. So highly recommend that particular series for beginning photographers. Oh, wow. Crazy. Okay, we'll go over one of the case studies then really quick, and then let's go to case study 2. Okay. If you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, I see that video froze when I answered that question. The series is called Snapshots: The Great Shots, for BP Symington, and again, there's a series of books that depending on the depending on the subject that you might be interested in. Snapshots: The Great Shots. There's a food photography one that I had picked up about a couple months ago. Actually, I'm really into food photography recently. But Snapshots: The Great Shots, you'll find several books within that learning, that beginning photography type of with the beginning photographer in mind. So I want to quickly go over this series of images. This is again a 4x3 image. It doesn't really work, I think, in terms of if this were a square image, and this is really more to show what does and what wouldn't work in an Instagram photo. The reason why I think this particular image worked in a rectangular frame is because it centers everything on screen. It shows the colorfulness of the game. I think that if the intent were to showcase specific characters are on each card, then this would be too much information. But my point for this photo was to show everything that was part of the game, and also show the cool looking box that I came in. Box is the wrong word. Tube that I came in. Next slide, please. So in this particular frame, in this particular slide, I want to showcase two different things. The original image was what was taken on the left-hand side. You'll notice that there's more on the left-hand side as far as numbers of cards goes. And one of the things that I don't have this as part of my Instagram, unfortunately, but one of the things I want to show on the right-hand side is it is exactly the same photo, but cropped down such that I'm focusing on cards 13 and 14, right? So if my intent of the photo on the left was to showcase, if the intent on the left frame were to showcase the expressions of cards 13 and 14, I think I do less than good job of doing so, because there's more things to look at around the frame, right? There's additional expressions from the other monsters that are captured as part of that frame, and there aren't quite as many if I look at the frame on the right. Like for me, if I look at the square frame, having the images across the diagonal is a big thing, because scientifically, apparently, I haven't done this on my own test to test myself, but when you're looking at a square frame, the diagonals and putting lines and strong impactful points across the diagonal is a big thing. And so you'll notice that cards 13, 14, and 3, and even in the original frame, they're put across the diagonal, but I think it makes a more impactful statement when you have less in the frame component-wise, more in the frame across the diagonal, because then you do have the ability to focus more on those particular cards, de-emphasizing the other cards that are around it. Next slide. What I want to showcase with this particular packaging was the lighting portion of my talk. So this was a situation where I thought the box itself, the packaging, was very playful. And like I was talking about earlier, what I would normally do in this case is I would use window light in order to photograph this, and that would be consistent with what I would do in the past. In this particular one, I actually used a flash modified. I used a harsh flash modified by a wider white sheet of paper in this. I don't remember if I used a white sheet of paper or if I used an actual photo light reflector. Pretty sure I used a reflector in this case. But camera image left, I had placed a reflector, and I wanted to do a kind of half by half, almost like a, oh, I can't remember the guy's name now, but Batman's arch nemesis in in Two-Face. Yeah, Two-Face. I wanted to do kind of a Two-Face mimicry, if you will, where I want to do half of it in complete light and the other half in complete shadow, and that was the intent behind this one, just to give it a certain look. I'm not obviously going to change the expression on the main packaging on the main monster's face, but just by modifying how I light this thing, I'm going to have a different effect. Another way you can think about it is based on the direction of the light is if you light yourself and you take a photo of yourself, you take a selfie from what the light that is shining from underneath looks way different than if the photograph is taken from slightly up top and on and in front of you, right? Same type of thing where you're looking at different angles, you're looking at different light sources, and really the point was just to show that you get a different feel, a different emotion out of an image based on where you place a light source, where the color of the light source. For example, if I use a warmer light, that would give it a different feel on the left-hand side of the frame left than if I were to use the cold light, which is what I did in this particular case. I can't remember if next slide, please, Desiree. Yes. So we're going to go back. So we're going to kind of wrap this up, which is wrap up this kind of workshop. I want to reemphasize again that those three things that we talked about before about aperture, shutter speed, ISO, those are all the technical terms for how we tell an impactful story. We're going to revisit the right-hand frame here to see what I did. So I have window light that's coming in from the back of the frame that I actually modified by rolling up a sheet of paper and trying to direct light at specific locations. Some of those shadows are actually the blind. I have vertical blinds on my windows, and so they are. I had to move them around so that I would get those long lines of shadows across this particular frame. And as I'm as I'm looking into my viewfinder on my camera or my iPhone, this one actually did take with an iPhone. So as I'm modifying the positions of my window slats so that I get the frame that I want, I tried to tell the story, and I tried to get the thing that I saw in my head. Now you'll notice that the items in the back, we talked about aperture earlier for SLR photographers. You can get the same type of effect. It's not the same exact thing, but you can get the same effect out of iPhones. I don't think the most modern iPhones have it, but so I have an iPhone XS. There's a portrait mode in iPhone XS, and that kind of mimics the fact of if you tap on the frame, then you can put something in focus, and things that are effectively behind it are going to be fuzzy or out of focus. You can get the same type of effect if you use the portrait mode. And for aperture, shutter speed, again, harder to modify in an iPhone. I don't think you can get that concept. I could be wrong. I don't use that type of feature as much. Next slide, please. And as we wrap this up, we can talk about tools of the trade. So these are the tools I typically use. And so if you're curious about how I get some of the photos, again, I have an iPhone XS. Some of the apps that I primarily use in order to do any type of post-production work, if I want to, say, increase color, increase contrast, if I want to raise the exposure, if I don't get the exact thing that I want coming out of camera. I love using Snapseed. That I promise I don't get anything, I don't get any monetary value by pushing Snapseed, but it is my mobile editing software of choice. And again, blank sheet of paper. That really is a good way to help modify light and to make light softer. Right hand side, if I'm doing product photography, is typically what I end up using. I was going to show some of the gear if people were interested, but we're running a little bit long on time. So, but I am a Canon photographer for no good reason other than I started off and I have Canon lenses, and I'm not. I don't get into the whole Sony versus Nikon versus Canon versus other debate. I think if you have a camera manufacturer, hello, yep, I'm still here. Okay. Whew. Yep. Next slide, please. So these are the last couple of slides. If you get absolutely nothing else out of this workshop, absolutely nothing else, next slide. And there's a bunch of question marks. This is the big reveal. Huge reveal. Okay, next slide. I'm waiting for it. This is a huge reveal, apparently. It's just a play. So at the end of the day, your Instagram photos should be reflective of what you want to convey to your audience, to yourself. The rules that I keep talking about are really guidelines that are meant to be first understood, but for me, they are meant to be understood so that you can break them, quite frankly. That's why I've been putting rules in quotes all of this time, because you want to break them, because not everyone is going to get the same type of impactful statement that I get out of it. There's no, we're all different. And certainly what I get out of it is going to be different from what everybody else gets out of it. So play with the photo, like actually play with all the different tools that are available to you. And there's one last slide, I think here, or maybe two more slides, I guess. So play, and then I think the next slide says, have fun with it, right? This is not a job. This is not, well, it's a partial job for me, but at the end of the day, I have fun with my photographs because I'm trying to tell a story. I love telling stories, whether they're visual or audible. And I just my medium just happens to be with photography and with board games. So board games are meant to be fun. So have fun with it. Like, do break all the rules, like take a bunch of photos, just have fun with it. And I think the last slide is my contact info.
We have a picture of you, and then I believe it's your contact info.
Oh yeah, there's my there's my board game shelfie, which you can see in my live frame too. Yeah, I like, no kidding, I play a lot of board games. And there's my contact info. So if you want to check out my website, it's up top. Those are my 3 Instagram accounts. And if you ever want to, I'll leave my personal email as well. So if you have any questions about photography in general, anything I've covered, you can send me an email and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And I think that wraps up what I have.